This is Wednesday, the 18th of April, 2012, and it is a rainy day in the north of England, I'm afraid. It's one of those days that never seems to get any grayer, it just stays as grey as it can. It's been an exciting couple of weeks in movement land. It's been remarkably active, actually. There's been a lot going on, and I want to kind of cover some of the stuff that has been going on at the moment. And good, okay, you can hear me, fantastic. As you will have heard from last week's show when Peter was addressing you guys, we have wrapped up our Z-Day season for the year, our Zeitgeist Day, our annual event day around the world. And the first thing I wanted to do was to catch everyone up on what happened in London. London's day, we measured in comparison with 2010, which was the last sort of independent day before we became the seat of the global event. So it's unfair to compare the efforts of the global event and the audience versus the audience we had this year. In 2010, we had something like 310 people in a lecture hall in Birkbeck College, I believe it was, and that was very nice. It was amazing to see that the place sold out and all the rest of it. This year, for the Friends House event, we had about 460 people, including people that just walked in off the street. It was really quite wonderful to see people just take an interest in a random event they had no idea was going to be on, and to come on in. And for the program that we had a screening of a film that I would recommend anyone see that is broadly in line with what we talk about. Not completely, but it doesn't have to be in order to get the fundamentals of what might be up with the economic system the way that we have it. And that was a film called The Economics of Happiness. This is a joint effort between several producers, including Helena Norberg-Hodge, who has been a sort of an economist and specializing particularly in life systems. Life systems being the kind of term that you'd be familiar with if you've read the works of John McMurtry. A little bit more on him later as well. This film essentially took as its grounding the economy, the real life economy and social system as it stood of a Tibetan town versus what happened when farming was liberalized, if you like, and internationalized, and when the country was generally subjected to economic pressures from the outside. And it's a remarkable thing to see in the film as they track slowly the degradation of not just the environment and the general fiscal effects upon these very once peaceful people, but the emotional and psychosocial effects of being sold to, being advertised to, as more and more Western brands made their way in and used the only currency they have, which of course is awareness and aspiration mentalities to sell their wares. Of course, the first thing that happens when you have an aspiration like that is you have to somehow belittle the consumer into wanting to better themselves by purchasing your product. And that's exactly what happened. Helena Norberg-Hodge saw firsthand the degradation of this Tibetan town's own identity, their moral and psychological identities being undermined as they began to see themselves feeling ugly and wanting to aspire to the Western norms and Western mores of social value and physical value. And it's really quite awful to watch. But it was a fantastic film to start Z-Day with because it was an ideal footing to get everyone up to date on the basics that we talk about, on what is actually wrong with the system. The problem is not too much or too little money. It's the interactions of money at all upon life systems. And it touches a little bit upon technology as well. So we had that first, which is very nice. And then we had a round of speakers. We actually diversified this year. One thing we try and do every year, and one thing I think we try and do generally in the movement, is to spread the speaking engagements out to as many new people as possible. I was originally not actually going to speak. I had written something, but we had so many of these new people that we wanted to put in that I'd put myself to the side. 2 or 3 others had done that as well, but we had a couple of dropouts at the last minute, so we had a bit of redundancy built in, which is very nice. So I actually ended up speaking in place of the slot that had fallen vacant. But we had a couple, and I'm going to run through them, actually, because we are making the videos for these, I promise. They are a bit late, which is unfortunate because some of the things that we talked about have now actually become extremely large news items, and I'll talk about that a bit in a minute as well. So the first person we started off with was Cassie Earle. Cassie Earle is one of the quieter members of the Zeitgeist Movement. She's not out banging the drum in the streets. She's actually a PhD researcher in what's called critical pedagogy, which is not what to think, but how to think about learning and how to educate oneself and others in a way that is even-handed with evidence and approaches to new information, understanding the framework from which you're coming, so that you can adequately absorb this information in the way that would be most fair, given that we live in a technical reality. We live in the real world. A lot of people might sneer and say, "Oh, that makes me a materialist." Well, that is in fact the state of affairs that we have. So that was very, very powerful. It went across very well. She's also an extremely good speaker, and we will have her slides up shortly. She has also since written a working paper, a conference proceeding, I suppose it is. It's essentially a scholarly article, an academic article, on the movement and its approach to education, how it engages with the wider world, our focus on the internet, and where that actually comes from, whether that comes from naturally what's available as a tool to spread information, or whether it's a particular tactic, and all the rest of it. And I've had a brief look at the sort of first draft of it, if you like, and she will be presenting that at a conference, and there'll be many more rewrites with other authors as well, in the context of critical pedagogy. So we will make that paper known as soon as it actually has become a published item, in as much as we're allowed. I'd imagine we're allowed to put the postprint for that up somewhere, and eventually, when there are enough articles from different areas, we will actually create some kind of repository of articles related to us by members of the academic community, whether they happen to be active for us or not. Of course, we want to include all of them, whether they're positive, whether they're negative, whether they're from our members who happen to be in academia, or whether they're not. That's fine. So that was very, very good. We had a gentleman called Dimitar Turovsky who broke down some of the myths and realities of the current system, which was very useful, actually. I learned quite a few things from that as well. Dimitar is at the moment, I believe, trying to make a film of some kind, a very short documentary. And we had the technical team from the Zeitgeist Movement as well. I'm not doing these in order, I know, but they're not in the order that they appeared, but they're in the order of my notes. The technical team, who are the people who are behind zeitnews.org. I'd highly recommend Zeit News as the starting point of your day. Wake up and find out all the new things that we've created that you're not going to see in the shops tomorrow, even though you should. It's a fascinating platform, and the team behind it are one of those wonderful types of movement member groups that just do stuff. They just get on with it, and they just create things. They don't spend too much time complaining, because there is a definite bent, a definite focus to technology that allows you to simply enact it, to produce whatever there is. And they were talking about their upcoming projects as well. One of those is called Zeit World, which is a mixture of news and social media network, where you can, for example, you can essentially act as an editor for the world, for the news that's coming around, and do a little bit of human processing of that news as it comes in, so that people can gauge the world news according to what's actually happening on the ground. And all the sources are very clearly listed and all the rest of it. So that was very interesting as well. We had a talk by Adam Maloney, who's also known as Adamantium. I don't believe he's related to the X-Man, who did a very challenging piece. Challenged a lot of people in the audience. Actually, we had some feedback that this was something not to their taste, but that's of course wonderful. If you walked away from any event of ours not feeling in some way challenged, or in some way wanting to rebut something that had been said, or think more about it, or engage in some kind of disagreement, well, what kind of event would that be if you walked away just blanketly agreeing with everything? That would be awful. It would signify a very strange set of talks. These are talks that are written individually by people. We don't sit and edit them. All we do is listen to them for timing's sake, and receive the presentations ahead of time, so that they're on every computer, so that we don't have any hold-ups. So there's no editorializing in that sense. We had Steve Morrison, also known as Zen, from Scotland, give a a negative feedback for how the movement's coming across, but positive ideas of what to do, which is very valid as well. We're not just banging the drum in a strange kind of way. We want to be critical and we want to be self-evaluating, and that's, of course, extremely important. So that was very good as well. I gave him some time during the middle of the day, I think it was. And then we had Shivani Verma, who is actually not a member of the movement at all, but she's actually a professional coach in public speaking, who got up and told people how to come across in speaking to the general public, or indeed anyone, about the mission or goal of the movement, to get people to engage with some of the more abstract and strange elements that we might talk about. They seem strange to people who've never thought of them before. So would a light bulb to a caveman. So that was very, very cool as well. And of course, it was very slick, and as it would be. And then we had actually one of her former students, a gentleman by the name of Miles Dyer, who did a very cool roundup of his own experiences trying to engage the media in a way that's socially relevant. Some of the cool stunts that he's done in the past. He was on, it was quite funny, he was on a reality TV show a couple of years ago that got pulled because he managed to undermine its premise of turning everyone against each other, and he actually managed to form an alliance with the group and make them beat the sort of game that they had invented. It was very cool. He has launched something called the Universal Solutions Project. This was actually active last year as well. It's essentially a wiki, a how-to wiki and an answer wiki for everything you might need during times of destabilization or anything else. Very, very interesting. It's crowdsourced, and if you want to get involved, check it out on Facebook, or just search Universal Solutions Project. Very, very interesting stuff. And I think that's it for everyone except myself. I ended up closing off the evening, even though I didn't plan to, with a piece on the prison system. Mixed with, well, what was my focus? My focus was mainly the American system, I guess, but there was a fair amount from medieval France, from Austria, from bits of Australia, to try and contextualize what the prison system actually does and what it is, and to allow people to think a little bit differently about what we do with the people who fall prey to the system's pressures and end up as criminals. There is by now very little scientific evidence to suggest that people are born bad. Only in the case of severe brain damage, if we are to believe the gentleman Simon Baron-Cohen and others. Only in extreme cases of brain damage do people have a mismanagement of their violent faculties. The general understanding now, and it has been so for quite a long time, is that it is a combination of some genetic factors and an extremely predatory, heavy, dangerous society that can turn people against each other, in fact requires people to be turned against each other. And those who are good, or one of those things. So I had spent about a year reading various pieces, and I put together a sort of collage of what the prison system functions as. How it could be repaired is not even for me to say. The answers are already there. If you read anything by James Gilligan, I picked 2 of his books and several of his articles from some of the online sources, which make it very, very clear that instead of punishing people, belittling them, encroaching upon their freedoms, locking them away, depriving them of light, of sunshine, of decent food, of social interaction, of all of those things that you would imagine would make a good human being, and somehow expecting them to become better. Instead of all that, you have to throw it out, and you have to go for something called positive reinforcement. You have to come from a perspective, as strange as it sounds, given the fact that we are in a culture that likes to punish people, that feels vindicated by punishing people, that enjoys the revenge mentality of punishing whoever is there, which is also understandable because, of course, a violent act towards yourself, the first thing is self-defense. And, the sort of self-defense mentality has been co-opted in a way in order to preserve this sort of punishment mentality, which in itself then controls the people who are not outside, well, they're outside the prison system. They're essentially members of society who are coerced into behaving properly, even if properly means actually to carry on with the flawed game that has been presented into which you've been born, without any ability to critically think over what actually it means to live in a society, and whether making a lot of money and becoming famous is going to somehow affect you well. Point me to anyone who does well from being famous, really, in terms of how people treat them, and I used to work in a theatre for a while, and I met a gentleman called Joe McGann. He's one of the McGann brothers. There's about 6 of them, and he would tell me that when he was not acting in the theatre on the stage, he would be down in bars around the town, and he would find himself belittled and spoken about in loud, rude ways. Because, and I'll quote him, he said, people think because you're famous they can just say anything to you. And, this is still somehow a value system, though, isn't it? That you should be famous and rich, but it'll expose you to a lot of awful things. So I covered that. And one of the key things that I covered, actually, which sort of answered our Q&A session, which we had in the middle of the day as well. We had about an hour set aside to ask the audience what they thought of our approach, what they thought could be better, what they thought was good, what they thought was bad. One of the points that was raised, and it's a common point, and it's one that we get accused of actually doing, was that we needed to get more into politics, or that we needed to somehow form a political party, or indeed vote for a honest government. Part of, and indeed actually the backbone of my lecture, talked about what the mechanisms for the American prison system actually are, and it comes down to the legal system. There's a group in America called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC for short, who are essentially a collection of dues-paying corporations. Coca-Cola was recently in it until they were kicked out, they left about a week ago. Nestle, I think, has now left as well, but amongst those were Corrections Corporations of America, which is a corporate for-profit prison system run sort of business, and Wackenhut and a lot of others as well. And these people, of course, have a vested interest in making sure that, unbelievably, the prison system should stay and should actually grow, and the prison population should increase and be stable, so it shouldn't be that suddenly you're effectively treating people and you can release a lot of actually safe people, having treated them well and with sympathy and empathy and with all of that positive reinforcement. That would, of course, lead to a drop in the prison population. And since these companies trade their stock on Wall Street based on how many people they have in prison, the built-in mechanism for reinforcement is, in fact, of course, to keep the prison system as high as possible, to maintain all of the hefty norms that, of course, increase crime and violence and division and neediness and scarcity, so that, of course, you can keep this very high, profitable prison system going. 2 million prison population people is 2 million meals 3 times a day, 6 million meals. That's a lot of money if you're in commissary services, as they call it. Those 2 million people will call home when they're allowed. That's telephony services. There are many more. Building and architecture is one of them. And this American Legislative Exchange Council essentially drafts dummy bills that will be passed, be actually sent back with the not senators, with the representatives back to their particular states, where they are already an outline of exactly the kind of law that they would like to have passed, regardless of what is actually working for society or what actually might be sensible for society. And these are then modified a little bit to, in the words of, in fact, one of them, if you listen to American Radio Works, this is actually quoted by the man, to make it look like it was his. And this is then lobbied and brought into Congress, and in fact doesn't even look like lobbying anymore, because the money was paid at an earlier stage, and the bill has been drafted at an earlier stage. Rather than having to be redrafted or pressured, the basis of that bill is already decided. And those things are then enacted, and this is true of the American Three Strikes Law. The Three Strikes Law holds that now, there are a set of usually non-violent offences, mostly related to drugs, that if you are caught 3 times, that's it. You got life in prison. Sorry. Or indeed you have an extremely long prison sentence. So that, of course, increases the number of people going to prison and how long they are in for. This is also the case with truth in sentencing, which is also an ALEC model bill. which allows you to hold back and minimize the ability for prisoners to become paroled, because you should serve the term as it was made in court, regardless of any effort of you to get better. So, of course, then you remove one of the strong reasons for why you should want to improve your behavior within prison. If you're just, if you're literally, it's a death sentence, you're just in and you're never getting out, it's life in prison, you're now a lifer, then what's that going to do to your behavior and the behavior of those who come into contact with you? There are many other bills like this, and the general point I wanted to make was that this really presupposes any ability to affect government in an honest way. To be able to vote for an honest government makes no difference, because the mechanisms that are in place, the corporate-funded structures that can deliver exactly what's needed for various corporations, is a priori, has already happened by the time that you're voting for the people. A lot of people said to me in 2011 that it was the Conservatives who made the cuts in the UK. It wasn't. That was going to happen anyway. We all know that. It was the result of the banking crash, which, of course, in a prior incarnation was the result of the oil crash. And, you can blame those people if you like. It doesn't matter who you'd have voted in for. You could have voted the most honest politician you'd want. The cuts are going to happen anyway. And so this needs to be understood. A lot of people still pin a huge amount of hope on politics, but I'm afraid that it is simply economics with a human face, and economics will do what the game will reinforce. And so I wanted to make that point. I was generally very impressed with Z-Day. I was very happy to see so many people provide positive and negative feedback. We had both. And it was, I would like to thank the people who are actually behind the scenes, who don't get up and you don't see them, and they're not a face in that sense, who actually organized it. Tom Williams is probably the main guy who helped us really create that. And I'd like to extend my personal thanks to him and Janan and all the rest of the people who quietly go, usually unthanked and unnoticed, and they probably like it that way, for organizing something that was in the heart of London. So that was very, very good. The general focus of the day, of course, was really education and rethinking and critical evaluation of how we interact with society. And that's actually no small matter. We generalize about education quite a lot. We talk about people like Alfie Kohn, who talk about what it means to have coercive education, all the rest of it. If you dial up something that I actually wanted to have for my intro, but the audio wasn't quite good enough, there's a YouTube speech by Jim Phillips, who's one of the UK's most active lecture team members. Again, another man who just sort of does it. It's so self-directed. It's wonderful. Where he talks increasingly about this. He talks at length about coercive education, what that actually does. But let's really back up and remember something. One of the fastest growing areas of the world at the moment is Islam. Islam is one of the biggest religions. It's one of the big three. I think it's actually number 2 at the moment. It might even be number 1. Now, consider this fact. Spain translates more books into Spanish each year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 9th century. It's a lot of people, and they are not being exposed to any or very little of the modern information that has actually come about through scientific interaction, through new social science, and even literature. Think about what that does on a level of global communal interaction. It means that we are on incredibly uneven footing. Even we well-read people in the West, so-called, are desperately lacking in how much information we know. This is very clear now. It's something that has festered for a while, but it's now actually having an effect on the operation of the society and on our ability to think about alternatives in the forms of energy, in the forms of alternatives to economics alone. You can see how ill-equipped people are, including myself. I'll put myself out there too, to really think about alternatives, something that surely should have been at the forefront of our minds since we were children. How is this something that's been avoided? Well, it's best left to the so-called experts. It's best left to not you. So education is extremely valuable and extremely underrated, even, I think, by certain members of the movement. It's not just about school sucks, right? It's really about how little we as a human race know, but how much potential we actually have to know, even with today's tools, even with what we have. But it is changing. I do see that as something that's happening. There's a couple of new documentaries that have been coming out. It's actually been a very active couple of weeks for this kind of particular direction that we advocate. We particularly call it a resource-based economy, an earth economy, a life economy, an economy that doesn't put money first, an economy that puts social function and the natural world first. And so there are a couple that I wanted to point out. The first one that probably people who are actually listening at the moment have probably already seen. There's a film called Owned and Operated, which beautifully crafts together the present system's issues, consumption, waste, advertising, all the usual stuff, economic imbalance, third world poverty, slavery, and all the rest of it. And then, in a sort of collage way, ties in the movements of Anonymous, the online hacktivists, the transition towns and transition movement. The Venus Project is in there with its own section as well. The Zeitgeist Movement appears in there as well, and the Occupy movement. And it puts it all together under a big umbrella of socially aware activism for alternative, overarching economic systems. It was made by a group called Crackin Studios. I'm not familiar with them. I don't know who they are. I did write to them and tell them that it was a great film. And it's actually done very, very well as well. It was posted, and it got very quickly to 30 or 40,000 views on YouTube before it had to be reposted because of a couple of very minor changes to, I believe it was a couple of annotations and all the rest of it. But it's already back up again at 14 or 15,000 views. I'd recommend it. It's about an hour and 47, and it's so nice to see people really understanding that, we say we're in the transition now, the transition from the old sort of industrial age, from the carbon-based age through to, this kind of new age that sees decentralization and smart grids and all the rest of it. The transition is all of these movements. The fact that there is even the question, when is the transition happening? The fact that you're even asking that, how do we transition, when do we transition, that's part of the transition. The reason you can even ask that is because you're aware of alternatives, and the alternatives are scientifically definable. They're not some kind of hokum that's trotted out by a political rhetoric. This is something that we can very much put our finger on. This documentary shows you all of that. You come away from that. I would be very surprised if at the end of it you are not tearful or at least moved by it. It ends with some very nice words from Christopher Hitchens that I've previously used on this show as well, that I want to live my life always hungrily operating on the margins of a potentially great harvest, that I don't know enough, that I can't know enough, that I've always got to be learning. And he passes that on to what is, I believe, an audience of young people, actually, because of the way he speaks to them. It's very valid, and all of these movements, in their various different ways and their slightly different tangents, are all pointing towards one thing, and that is global survival or global death. We need to be living as well as we possibly can. We need to be maximizing everything. It is literally retarded of us to not be using the tools that we actually have, the best tools for advanced agriculture, and therefore clean food, and therefore better health, and therefore less need for a giant healthcare system. And on the other side, a really streamlined healthcare system. It's becoming more and more obvious as more and more people start suffering, and that repressed voice starts to gain momentum because there are more of the repressed voices speaking now, and because we have some of the technological tools to get that message out there. So I'd highly recommend it. Owned and Operated. It's with an ampersand, but you can search Owned and Operated. Have a look at it. It's wonderful. Another one is by a gentleman called Dale Hallett and the New Future Media, called I Lost My Job. Dale actually originally made a film that I also used in my prison lecture as a sort of research project, called Punishment, a Failed Social Experiment. But he's just made a 38-minute film, or him in a group anyway, a 38-minute film called I Lost My Job. It's essentially on technological unemployment. For those of you who don't know what technological unemployment is, and I apologize for those of you who do know, who hear me go on about this like a broken record, technological unemployment is what's going to happen to you when the machines are better at doing your job than you are, and they are cheaper too. And the wonderful thing about technology, or at least the machines, is that they actually halve in costs every year. So they're catching up to you pretty quickly, no matter what you're doing, in both scope and how much it costs to hire you. There are 3 broad books that I would recommend for this. Some of these are cited in the film, but not all of them. One of them is the book by Jeremy Rifkin called The End of Work that we talk about. That actually comes at it from a different angle. It explains the logic of it and explains the history of it, from the first industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution, through to the machine-operated, essentially, second industrial revolution, and why it is that we have black inner cities. You know, the poor black communities in inner cities are the product, in a sort of way, of original farmhands moving to cities to get jobs in factories, and of course then being immediately displaced by automation, which of course is sort of implicit to the factory ideal, really, isn't it, in some sense. And it talks about how the rise of the third sector, or the voluntary sector, the sort of peer-to-peer sector, the sort of almost moneyless sector, that kind of voluntariness, is going to offset and be grown by this kind of replacement by the machines. Very good book. As usual with Rifkin's work, it's written for everyone, which means that really anybody with no technological know-how or jargon abilities can actually just dive into it. It's a tremendous book. Came out in 94, 95, I think. There's another one called Race Against the Machine, which is quoted in the film, which is very much worth reading. It's extremely short. It doesn't quite make the right arguments, I don't think. It does explain all of the logic behind machine automation and exactly what the curve is in terms of ability. It's useful in that sense, very much like Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, is useful in terms of just understanding the rapid pace of technological change. That was my first ebook that I ever read, and that alone is already putting people out of jobs. Just think about that. The rise of the ebook alone is going to have a profound effect on bookstores and everybody who works for those. It's going to have a profound effect for the architecture and systems of publishing companies, and indeed of, it's a ridiculous thing to say it, but of course things like furniture that holds books aren't going to be manufactured anymore, or to a lower degree as well. And that of course includes not being able to sell those through third parties. That's very minor. We're talking here really about the instant ability to publish worldwide. That alone has the effects that we're talking about. Sorry, bit of a ramble. Race Against the Machine. It sort of stops short of being able to offer solutions. It talks about some changes to our economy, but it doesn't quite go far enough, because the bottom line of all of this is that once you've automated a particular amount of jobs and there's a particularly large unemployment figure, you don't then really have the buying power to buy the things that are being created by those machines. So it's sort of a self-defeating premise. Of course, we want the extremely rapid and exact and efficient production and design and distribution of goods. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as those goods aren't being consumed in a way that is detrimental to the overall life system. Just like if you eat too much pie, you're going to have a problem as well. So it's a particularly interesting book. It's a good starter book. I would say it's a good place to start, if anywhere. And the third book is The Lights in the Tunnel by Martin Ford. Lights in the Tunnel has been talked about before in this show by Federico. It's a little bit bigger, and it makes some valid points as well. It has a rather strange central metaphor to visualize the way that jobs are replaced. But nevertheless, it does manage to get its point across. Again, doesn't really go quite far enough, I don't think. It tends to stop short. A lot of authors are very, very afraid of what they do themselves actually know. Martin Ford is very, very aware of people like Ray Kurzweil, is very aware of exactly what technology can do. But it's too difficult, I think, for most authors, for obvious reasons, to come out and say, listen, you are going to have to get used to the idea that one day money is going to be a fringe thing. It's going to be something that's in only some parts of the world that have still not quite automated yet, and then it'll be rapidly disappearing because there'll be no global economy worth speaking of. It'll either be hyper local. I mean, this sort of happened in Germany a few years ago, where they designed local currencies that could only be used in certain states, just to get local businesses going. And it's quite a clever idea in the short term, I suppose. It'll be that, or it'll be nowhere, because we're going to get to the point where there is no buying power, where the production is so cheap that it's insulting to even ask for money, and where the general value system understands that profit doesn't mean anything except a measure of how well you've managed to screw someone over, or just how necessary your product is for others, and they will pay anything for it. What a strange idea of good value that actually has become. So I'd recommend all three of those books to you. It is something that's very contentious. In fact, I recently had a conversation with a gentleman right before an event in Portsmouth called Crashonomics, which we organized alongside a group called Positive Money. This gentleman was an organizer of the sort of a venue space, and he said, well, that's not really going to happen, is it? Because, I mean, machines are pretty dumb, and, someone's going to have to do jobs. People do need jobs, don't they? Otherwise, what would they do? And so you do have to become very au fait with the very obvious economic impact, and you need to be able to list sources for this and be able to make a cogent argument. Otherwise, you sound a bit weird. You might sound a little bit like someone who's imagining some kind of Terminator future. In fact, I was recently watching Terminator Salvation, and I was amazed. Like, when I was 13 or 14, when I first saw Terminator 2, I thought it was great, and I thought it was so realistic. This is of course the first film. Terminator 2 was the first film that really where the effects haven't aged, because they hit a point where they just are realistic for anyone. They correctly portray exactly what they're doing in that way. There's no dodgy dinosaurs that are controlled by mechanics or any of that stuff. It was really the first time that we'd used real 3D modeling for it. But if you understand that the reason that those Terminators look the way they do isn't because that would be an ideal killing machine, it's that they are meant to look like you so that they're scary for you, with the red eyes that wouldn't signify any technological meaning as to being able to see better or worse, the limbs that move like an awkward skeleton, where wheels or 10 legs would be much better, and arms and even shoulder blades. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? I was watching it recently, and I was thinking, this is an ideal example of how we see technology. We throw our human face on it and call it evil because of what we do. As Arthur C. Clarke said, it'll be pretty obvious who would start the war with the machines, if there could even be a war with the machines. And he's thoroughly right. Anyway, yes, this is a general point, to be able to humanize the idea of robotics, humanize the idea of technological automation, humanize the whole process, and make it very clear that we're not talking about the machines taking over. We're simply talking about the correct tools to automate dull manual labor that you wouldn't want to do if you had the choice. Speaking of that, sorry, I know I'm rambling today. I've had a headache all day, so do forgive me. Plus, audio seems not to be working, so I don't know if I can play the Molecularist interview that I promised to. I'll look into it. We'll try it again later. If not, I will be with you till the end. Speaking of the Crashonomics event in Portsmouth, that was 28th of March, I think it was, or 27th of March, I forget. This was organized by a couple of our members, and what they did was, it was essentially a sort of a bifocal event. So it was two different movements who complement but don't necessarily completely agree with each other. One is Positive Money, Ben Dyson and all the rest of them, who do a very good job explaining how banking works to people like you and me, and possible short-term solutions to fixing this ridiculous ballooning debt cycle and damaged bloated economy of feeding the banks at the expense of the life host, as we would say. And ourselves, the Zeitgeist Movement. I did a brief half-an-hour speech there. It has been recorded. There is a video for that coming as well. We're working on it, I promise. It's not a bad thing that these things are being delayed, because it does mean that we have a constant stream that can come out in portions and not all at once. And that was a very good event too. We had a full house for that. It was only a small event. They only had about room for about 80 people there, but we had about 60, 70 people turn up, which is very nice. And they were generally very positive. We had some good questions. I actually got the Q&A recorded as well. And it was very nice to see. I mean, there were people coming from Brighton all the way to Portsmouth. It's not round the corner, really, if you're just coming around to see us. We're not that notable. And what's so nice with that is it's evident that people are really interested in this direction. They're interested in understanding and thinking about society to the point at which they will book a train ticket that will, at expense to themselves, and bring friends and sit and ask intelligent questions and help with intelligent feedback and stick around afterwards to talk to people. This is nothing but wonderful, and I wish every social movement all the best with exactly this kind of trend, because it seems to be there. And I would recommend you check out Positive Money too. Just check them out, have a look at their stuff. If anything, just to learn about how money works if you're not sure yet, and just to hear from a source other than ourselves that the problem is exactly what we say. Fractional reserve banking, making money out of nothing, interest not created out of the actual money supply, but just invented, and it's a race for whoever can return the interest first is the person who doesn't default, and it's the last person through the post who has to default. There's no money for them to be bailed out, and then at some point the whole thing crashes anyway, and the banks do get bailed out. Hey presto, 1 and 1 equals a million. So yes, that's Positive Money. Very, very useful indeed. Would highly recommend it. Another bit of news. Yes, Peter has just announced that he is now focusing his efforts on a new web series called Culture in Decline, which will be no doubt focusing on the ills of our present culture, so a little bit more on the cultural side rather than economic side of things, I'm guessing. I'm not sure. First episode of that is out in July, and you can see it under cultureindecline.com, I believe it is, or at least you can type Culture in Decline into Facebook and you'll probably find the website, and there's a Twitter and YouTube account. I highly recommend subscribing ahead of time so that you'll get your notifications. Could be very interesting. It's going to be monthly, so it's going to be something regular from PJ, which is great. And he's also working quietly behind the scenes on Beyond the Pale, which might be a non-Zeitgeist film, but who cares? It's just interesting to see this stuff. I personally think his films are great. They've always made me think. You don't have to agree with absolutely everything, but if it makes you think, that's important. Even if you have to reason why you disagree with it, at least you've started reasoning, and that's a good thing. A note from one of the authors that we talk about quite a lot, John McMurtry. He is bringing out, I don't know when, an updated version of The Cancer Stage of Capitalism. This is a book that we've spoken about before that essentially came out in, I think, 98 or 99, which laid bare the basic functions of the modern monetary paradigm in the rather upsetting and very exact metaphor, if you like, of what cancer does to a body. He himself has had cancer. His brother is a doctor. And in fact, he makes a point very early on that it's not ridiculous to actually suggest a medical term as a metaphor for a social term, because in fact, we get a lot of our social words from the medical industry to begin with. I'll give one example to you: consumption. Consumption now, of course, when you hear it, means the act of using goods or products of society in such a way as to render them as having fulfilled their purpose, off the top of my head. You eat food, you live in a house, you buy products. That itself is consumption and whatever. Now, of course, consumption to an 18th century person or 17th century person means something quite different. It is the act of tuberculosis. It's the disease, rather, of tuberculosis, which is a consumption of the body in an incorrect way. And I think one of the things that's going to happen in the next few years, as people start making this jump back to the original meaning of the word, if you like, trying to reinterpret this term that we use, is that people are going to start hearing that meaning first again. They're going to start understanding what Thomas Hobbes called the Leviathan, this giant social entity, if you like, the cumulative connectedness of everybody into an organism that has knowledge and has a physicality and has systems, very much like a blood system and nerve circuits and all the rest of it. And is going to start seeing that consumption is actually really very close to the idea of what its original term meant. So he does make the point that it's okay to use cancer as a metaphor for turning life goods and what he calls the life ground, the grass, the trees, the environment, into a dead, wasted space and empty money. Just money creation is a sort of a cancerous process of co-opting and actually mimicking the sort of life behavior. The replication of cells is still a sort of a life syntax, if you like, but its end product is no longer valuable to the live host and is in fact dangerous to the live host. Anyway, enough of that. He is bringing out a new version of that, and it will encompass the events of 9/11 and the concomitant 2008 crash, all the way through 2010, and building in a little bit more on Vietnam, he tells me as well. So it's going to be a very updated work. I, for one, will be rushing to Amazon to get it as soon as it comes out. And I will gladly give my copy away for free of the original one that I have. There are only a few notes in it. So around the time it comes out, if any of you can't buy the book or don't want to buy the book and you want a free copy, just ping me and you can have mine. All right. I'll even pay for postage. So that's all very, very good. He's also at the moment one of the editors for the Encyclopedia of Life Support Systems, something that I've been meaning to get a subscription to for a while. It's actually pretty inexpensive, and it's organized by UNESCO. And it's the equivalent of 600 volumes of essentially social science work on life systems worldwide, whether that's applied mathematics or social science or any of those kinds of things that can talk about and describe the environment as it supports and generates life. So it should be a very interesting read as well, at least as a broader data set for members of the movement. In fact, I might look at getting an institutional login for our entire movement if it's affordable. Right. So upcoming activism as well. Sorry, this is a very long intro actually. There is at the moment an effort that was actually coordinated originally by the Canadian chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement, who are very much pounding the pavement and engaging everybody on the street about thinking about just this information, taking away leaflets, linking to torrents for films and giving out DVDs and all the rest of it. And it's called the One Planet Project. It's essentially a short way of describing a particular way of presenting ourselves, a particular leaflet with particular points, a particular link to the orientation guide or the films or the lectures, whatever we have that we've created over the last, 2.5, 3 years since we've been active. There's actually one of these in London if you're around. I know my focus is generally the UK. I do apologize to my international audience for that. And it is being done. I believe it's the 12th of May. And get in touch via Facebook. Go onto Facebook. The Zeitgeist Movement UK group has got information on that. Cliff, our man Cliff Begley is organising bits of that. It'll probably be on the South Bank. We're not sure yet. But there'll be that. So if you want to get involved in a little bit of street activism, the One Planet Project for that is the place to go. And in fact, also on April 29th, which is quite just around the corner, actually, there is an event at the Red Lion Pub Function Room in Hemel Hempstead called "What is a Resource-Based Economy?" If you haven't seen James Phillips live yet, you need to. He will be there discussing the fundamentals of a resource-based economy as he does. He has a couple of standard slides that he uses to speak in schools, and he'll be appropriating and changing those in order to sort of allow new people to think about this kind of information. So, with all that, I'm going to very quickly attempt to try and play my latest interview, which I did with the Molecularists. The Molecularists are a group in Germany who were on, I think, about a year ago. Oh, almost a year to the day, I think, actually. Who share some of our basic premises and certainly see the long-term goal of a resource-based economy as absolutely necessary. But they have a particular transitional bent where they're trying to unify the world, at least in governance, so that there is things like freedom of movement, freedom of information, certainly, and no private armies by each individual country anymore and all the rest of it. There are various points I could argue with Richard Morley from the Molecularists, and indeed I do in this audio, but I'm going to try and play it now, and if it doesn't work, then I'll only apologize, and I will just carry on rambling for another, as long as I can. Let's give it a go. So, Richard, thanks for joining me. It's been, I think I worked out, it's been 8 months since we last spoke, when we first sort of went through the concepts of molecularism, which I think was about 2 hours. Obviously, since then, quite a lot has happened. We've seen the Occupy movement, we've seen the Arab Spring, we've seen a fair amount of debt default, we've seen, all the kind of stuff that we were talking about that I think has sort of spurred on part of your worldview, maybe. And you've obviously had time to communicate this stuff to other people and to various groups and to gauge some of that feedback. So today what we want to do is to run through the objections, the concerns, the responses that you've had in that intervening time. Is that all right?
Oh, wonderful, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining me. So let's see, where should we start? I think your movement, as well as ours, gets accused of one thing above all else, and it's one I'll level at you right now as well. This idea, this worldview, this supposed new system of yours is rather idealistic, is utopian, is actually impossible. We can't get there. It will never happen. Would that be a fair way of putting that?
Well, certainly, by far and away, the largest concern that has ever been given to me has been that very issue. The fact that many people think that molecularism, wonderful idea, everyone tells me, really like the system. It would be wonderful if we had it. If only. But, they say to me, we'll never get it through. We'll never be able to beat the system because the system is so strong. It commands every element of our lives, every element of the planet, and it is hopeless to think that we could actually get this wonderful idea into being. And by far and away, that has been the greatest observation given to me. And I have to say that we should not look at it with pessimism. The future of the world is always a process of change and evolution. It has been going on since mankind started. That in the last million years we have evolved and developed our way along this wonderful road of life. And there is no doubt that the current system that we have will evolve into something different and something better. Now, I say to everybody that if you look around you, you just go out into the street and see the world around you, you all know that there is something fundamentally wrong. It's obvious when we simply just look at our high streets. We look at our bank balances. We look at the hours that we're working. We look at the conditions under which we're living. We look at the number of people who are unemployed around us. The system is going seriously wrong. And the central question must always be, is the current system able to adapt itself to meet all these concerns that we have? Or do we have to replace the current system to get a new one, to get a better one, a system that can react to all these problems? And the answer to that can be really very quickly and very simply understood. We have seen the current system attempt to adapt itself to just one of the significant problems that we're facing, namely climate change. And we have seen from 1993 at Rio all the way through Kyoto and Copenhagen and Durban, we have seen the repeated inability of the current system to remotely deal with the climate change problem. And the climate change problem is the one we really have to deal with, because if we don't deal with the climate change problem, then quite frankly the entire ballpark here is wasted. We're going to basically be exterminated as a species unless we do something about this problem. It makes all our economic worries seem inconsequential if we can't deal with this central climate change issue. But the international system is incapable of dealing with it. Consequently, it is only a question of time before that current international system is replaced. It has to be. The question is, do we do it before that reality finally strikes home, when we have massive climate disasters around us, when we've got wind speeds of 150, 200 miles an hour smashing down buildings, we've got tsunamis that going 200 miles inland? Do we have to wait that long, or are we going to say, enough is enough, the current system has had its chance, we've got to change it now? I think that the hope that I can say to people which will make them believe that the system is not idealistic is therefore very simple. We have to have change, and this change will happen. It is up to us to make certain that the change follows logical and sensible lines. And that will evolve from our collective human spirit. And if we believe in this future and we believe in the direction of molecularism, we can all fight for it. Of course, if people simply just sit and do nothing all their lives and ignore all these issues and simply just carry on having a wonderful life or whatever life they can have without concerning themselves about these international affairs, then change is less likely to occur. But as we have seen in Egypt and Tunisia and several other countries where uprisings have taken place recently, when the people collectivise and act together, they will succeed in destabilising the regime enough to basically force change. And the greatest power, Ben, that the people have today is something which not many people are talking about. We don't really realise the strength that people have, and it's in their consumption, their consumer pattern, that the strength of the people really lies. Why? Because the entire system depends upon these people, all of us namely, buying things continuously. If we were to change that, which we could by coordinated action, we don't need to go onto the streets and all get into a square. We don't need to occupy Wall Street to make change. We simply have to stop occupying McDonald's to make change, to stop occupying the department stores and the great company chains, to stop giving our money to the very people who are oppressing us. That's the real zone of occupation, is to get out of it, not to get into it.
Okay. Well, there's a few points. I'll take them in the order in which they were raised. The Arab Spring is, of course, a wonderful thing to mention because it is, again, it's coordinated action. It seems international. It seems borderless. However, what were those states surpassed by, or what are they being surpassed by? We've seen military dictatorship. We've seen, to some extent, a very careful rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We've seen, essentially, the reverse of progress. We've seen a fundamental readaptation to prior values or established values, or simply another party. Do you not think that those have been limited to the choices given to them by, essentially, still the elites?
Indeed. Many of the uprisings are being orchestrated, in fact, by the elite, for various purposes that are obvious when you realise the economic interests of the elite. So I do not for one moment believe that these uprisings are themselves a movement that is going to transform the world. They are not. What they do, however, is that they indicate the fragility of the structure, and they indicate the potential of people to act decisively when they are eventually unified. Mm-hmm. And the force of climate change, the relentless power of these disasters that lie in front of us, the complete economic instability of the current system, which perpetually forces financial and life hardships upon us, when these realities hit home more and more, year after year after year, and remember, the establishment may well even throw a third googly at us and take us all to war again, which would even be another pressure in favour of change. When people realise that they have to fight, they will fight. They have done so in many countries in the last year. It's only a question of time before the whole of the Western world realises that it simply has got to get rid of this cancer that is not only occupying the West now, but has spread its talons well and truly across the globe and intends to basically control the whole show. Namely, an economy and a social system based entirely upon greed. Consumption, greed avarice. As long as we have those as the values of society, celebrated by the glamour of our celebrities perpetually paraded in front of us, as long as we live by that standard, of course, the elite will continue their domination. But it can't last forever, because more and more people are getting stretched off the end. More and more people are falling off the bottom of this system. And where are they? A young man said to me in Oakland the other day when I visited the occupation movement there, and I asked him, what do you do? He was an activist. And he said to me, well, it was a damn stupid question. What do you think I do? I mean, I can't do anything in society. No one will give me a job. I've got no qualifications, I've got no training, no hope, no future, no home. What do you expect me to do? The only thing I can do is to fight. And I said to myself, right on, young man. That's the sort of spirit which will keep this revolution going. Okay, the Occupy movement is fragmented, doesn't really know where it's going at the moment, and certainly the process of occupation has its legal limitations which the establishment are finding ways to meet. However, as I keep saying to everybody, the one thing the establishment cannot stop is your decision to stop spending your money.
Okay, so
no one can force you to spend your money.
Okay, so
and that's the place where the battle should be fought.
So here comes the second objection which I was going to raise, which is that you're absolutely correct, there's a sort of over-consumptive mentality, is the slave to advertising, there's the product consumption, all the rest of it. However, a great many people in this system can't fend for themselves and have to consume in order to survive. You can scale it back, but ultimately anything that's for sale is still within the monetary market system, is still prone to inflation, is still prone to the kind of corruption that is, of course, the basis for the need for having to exchange. At the same time, we've seen the dying off of skills to fend for yourself, even from basic gardening food all the way through to being able to mend your house or live in some way. Or orientate yourself in transport and all the rest of it. So we actually now have a system that requires consumption.
Yes. Can I just clarify one point here, Ben? When I'm saying we should stop our consumption, we should reduce our consumption, I am not talking about going hungry. I am not talking about ignoring the basic fundamentals of life, which of course we all have to do. We all have to eat, we all have to drink, of course we do. This is not what I mean by the word consumption. Consumption, as I am intending it to be understood in this context, means when you are buying something you don't need. That is consumption. When you are buying something that you could easily do without, you are buying it like sort of happy money spent, where it makes you feel better because you're spending this money. There's a word for this type of consumerism, I think, but I've forgotten it at the moment.
Being a shopaholic, certainly.
Well, yeah, but comfort. Yeah, it's called comfort consumption. Comfort consumption. Of course, the point is that the best way to get comfort is to have friends, to have people next to you that give you pure human warmth. That is the best way to get comfort, not to go out and buy consumer products. That's the way to lead you away from comfort, in actual fact. This is what I'm talking about. But I'm also talking about the way and the direction in which we spend our money. For example, if we go to giant corporations, we are going to help those giant corporations. Okay, they may be 10%, even 20% cheaper than the local shop next door. But the point is that the local shop allows small businessmen to continue in operation. And we are brothers with the small businessman, with the privately owned independent company. Down the road, they are our brothers in the same way as we are brothers with the people who are needy and unemployed. Because we're all part of the 99%. When we're talking about the 1%, we're talking about a tiny elite of plutocrats, sat up high in their corporate positions, controlling hundreds of companies. Not Joe Soap running his grocery store down the road with his family. And these are the people that we should try and support the most. So when we're choosing to go shopping, choose always to go to a local store, even though it costs a bit money. And when you don't need to buy something, then don't buy it. When you want a party and you want to collect together for drinks with your friends, have it in your home. Maybe you want to go and hire a room and bring the stuff in from the local supermarket or the local wine store is better, so that you can therefore have your drinks and parties at home and don't go to the bars. Don't give the money to these giant Wetherspoon corporations, for example, milking it out of people because they can't have a drink together at home.
Okay,
That's what I mean about controlling consumption.
So we do that. What's the first effect of a change in consumption, a lowering, what would be a drastic lowering of consumption in terms of, pure buying?
As we saw in the autumn of 2008, a 2% drop in consumer expenditure has the most enormous effect upon the stock market.
So what happens then?
Money.
What happens then?
Well, what happens is that the markets become unstable and the value of shares fluctuates up and down in chaos. And the result of that is that the power of the people who own these shares, the power of the people who control these corporations is weakened because, of course, their power relies entirely upon the confidence trick. See, these companies, they don't really have hundreds of billions of dollars in assets and reserves. They simply try to create the impression that they have hundreds of billions of dollars in reserve. In actual fact, they don't. They've very often got all sorts of crazy property stuck around the place which are empty, unusable, unwanted, but still high on the asset list, for which they're able to use that as assets to borrow other money and do other things. The point is that confidence is the key factor that keeps the corporate system in place, and confidence is shaken by a change in consumer expenditure from the population.
So let's extrapolate that. Markets are in turmoil, banks start calling in loans, presumably. Yes. Interest rates shoot up on properties. People start losing the houses that you're suggesting that they have their parties in. So doesn't that immediately affect all the people who are indentured in the system?
One thing is for certain, is that when the system crashes, which is what you're talking about, there is a limit to the number of homes that banks can actually repossess. What do they do if they own the entire housing stock and no one's even got the money to pay the rent?
Well, they sell them to vulture capitalists who like to buy a lot of cheap property in a bad market.
And property is worth nothing unless you've actually got people that pay you, the property owner, the maintenance of the property. Okay. Everything needs maintaining.
Did that happen in Detroit, where a great deal of the population left, where there's now 49% unemployment, in Michigan at least? The
market in Detroit completely collapsed and the city became basically a dead city. But of course that is the ultimate direction of capitalism.
Yes.
That we keep thinking of capitalism in these fanciful science fiction dreams that we see in the Hollywood films of great palaces and highways in the sky and all that's the future. I think we ought to actually relook at the future realistically and realise that Detroit is probably a better example of where we're going than Blade Runner.
Exactly. So what do we do at that point, you see, to be able to get to a system that is being described as quite utopian?
Well, the point is that what we do not want to have happen, and that is a complete collapse of the capitalist system. We do not wish to see systemic collapse. However, what we're talking about is the ability of the population to demonstrate its power and its resolve to achieve change. And people can demonstrate that ability by making changes in consumer expenditure, which can be centrally coordinated and targeted to achieve maximum effect for minimum damage.
So do you think that you see the rise of local exchange trading systems, these LETSs, where people are essentially a little bit like a time bank, where they're exchanging hours of labour directly first, as a first step?
I can see that as certainly being a way in which people can help to increase the pressure on the system, for certain. But of course, in itself, it is not going to cause the systemic change that we require. It's rather like a glacier. A glacier moves very, very slowly, bit by bit by bit, but the pace of its acceleration increases with every bit that it comes down. And eventually it reaches a critical point where the whole thing simply just gushes down as if somebody's taken the plug out of a bath. Now, the point is exactly the same thing is true for this current system, this global economic social system. Slowly by slowly, it's weakening and being denuded. One day, the critical mass will be achieved and it will simply collapse. And of course, the people that you're talking about, these Let's people, are contributing towards that critical mass. But I'm saying that we have to do more as the 99%. We have to go out and actually reduce the power of the elite by changing our spending patterns in targeted ways. And then we can demonstrate the power of the people. And then, of course, the capitalist system will listen to us. Because, of course, it knows that if it doesn't, it's mass chaos and breakdown. And so our objectives must always be to get the system to change voluntarily rather than by force of arms or force of terror or force of social collapse. Because when that happens, people suffer. And we want, of course, to minimize suffering wherever we can.
Okay, then. Well, from a sort of a general disagreement, on the sort of idealistic or impossible nature of it, why don't we move through some of the more systemic concerns? We won't. We can very briefly summarise. I think it becomes evident, actually, if you summarise what the objections are, the kind of system we're talking about. They can also go and, of course, see your website. Is it molecularism.com?
Indeed.
Yeah. And they can also review the original Blog Talk Radio post, which I think goes, 2 hours into explaining the ins and outs of this system. So we'll leave that to one side. The first element, which I would imagine of the systemic nature that I would imagine causes most concern for people, might be this idea of freedom of movement we talk about, a boundless, stateless sort of world society of free movement, right? Now, the first thing that people will think about is immigration issues, because of course we've got those now, right? So what do you say to the accusation, or the suggestion, the implication, that freedom of movement will result in masses of populations moving to the most resource-rich areas, that it will cause bureaucratic chaos, that it will cause mass depopulation of some areas and overpopulation of others, as those with the best means to travel go to the areas that they see would suit them best?
Well, for a start, I would answer that by saying that you cannot simply impose a molecular system overnight in its entirety. It is, of course, itself a process which, once initiated by a decision at the United Nations, will probably take somewhere between 15 and 20 years to complete. So let's get that very clear. When we're talking about freedom of movement, we're talking about a system which would gradually be extended in the same way as it started within the European iron and coal system of the 1950s, which was the forerunner to the EU. And then, of course, it was the European Economic Community, and it gradually grew to encompass almost all the European states as it does today. And so, therefore, freedom of movement and freedom of goods and so forth, this general homogenization of states, which is what we're really talking about here, this is something which grows, and it grows within a region. And so, obviously, what would happen once the process is initiated at the United Nations is that regions would be demarked, and within those regions there would be a move towards a European-style integration of those regions, so that there will be freedom of movement amongst them. And this natural fact is already in place in a lot of regions around the world today, not just in Europe. There is freedom of movement in a number of other zones amongst local nations. And of course, eventually, those regions would be combined so that there would be inter-regional freedom of movement. And of course, eventually, there would be total global freedom of movement as one of the last elements to go into place. And this, of course, is something which would, I think, allay a lot of the fears that you're talking about. But, you know, Ben, that isn't the only thing that is behind these fears, because very often people are using sort of economic pretexts to hide a fear of, shall we say, racial dilution. You know? And let's not forget that although many listeners to your program on this channel may well be coming from many liberal and left-wing backgrounds, that the world isn't only composed of people that are coming from this political stance. There are a lot of people out there on the right who have still some very old-fashioned ideas about race, and they do not like to see communities becoming intermingled. And it's both not only just amongst Western communities, it's also very strong amongst Asian and African communities as well. Now, that fear, I think, has to be addressed. And that is the reason why I do believe in... you said that earlier on we were moving towards a stateless world. And of course, I'm sorry, but that isn't actually what molecularism is about. Molecularism is about the enhancement of the individual state. In other words, we should have more states, less super nations like China and Russia and Brazil. We should have more, shall we say, manageable sized states. And these states, because of freedom of movement, would attract particular cultures, particular ideologies, particular types of people. And we would actually have greater cultural diversity and therefore greater opportunities for people to have this idea that may attract some right-wing people to have, you know, more purist concepts. It would allow them to exist within a global framework, because you see, really, if people want to live in a white-only community, the most important thing to know is that anybody who is in that community who doesn't want to stay there is able to leave. Yeah. That people are not imprisoned within this community. And you would ask yourself as a black person, would you really want to go and live in a state where the people wanted it to be all white? So consequently, we may well have some states which, by the choice of the occupants, tend to be racially singular and culturally singular. But I don't think we should be frightened of that. But what we should be frightened of is people being imprisoned within those states. And that's what our current system does at the moment. We basically force people to stay in their countries where they are born, whether they like it or not. They therefore become subjects, which is a phrase actually used in the language. You become a subject of a state. You become subjected to the oppression of that state. And that, of course, is wrong. Because the way to improve democracy, first and foremost, is to make the state accountable to the people. And the greatest accountability any state can have is by the freedom of the people to leave it. Therefore, the oppressive regimes that we have in this world today are likely to disappear when people no longer have to tolerate them.
I can see a lot of merit to that, actually. One thing I would throw up as a potential question, a genuine question of mine, is if you do allow for, or at least foresee maybe, the rise of some states that would be, let's say, aggressive in their ideals for a so-called pure race, even though, of course, we know that doesn't really exist. You might also allow states which have a particular bent on acquisitiveness, i.e. taking over neighbouring states. Do you think that would be a possibility?
Well, bearing in mind that the whole precept of molecularism involves that there is only one military force on the planet, and that is the force at the disposal of the very, very democratic Federal Central Union, and that force draws soldiers and military personnel from all over the world, and so it's a multinational, multicultural force fighting to achieve order and to prevent the sort of thing that you're talking about. And no nation, no state is allowed to have an army beyond that which it might need for domestic management. Therefore, the point becomes irrelevant, because molecularism actually does not believe in the continuation of private armies by individual states anymore. There is only one army, the collective army of us all, which is directed by an international system which we all participate in, beyond the participation of the current United Nations system, which of course was a good idea, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough today in the needs that we have for it in terms of what it should be doing and how it should be administered. The democratization of the United Nations is essential for its future viability. And which is why inside the Molecular Manifesto, point number 2, I believe, is the real need for real democratic structures to be put into place. And it's not very difficult, really, because all that I've basically considered on this matter is the fact that if you have democracy built upon one column, it's easy to pervert it, easy to corrupt it, easy to twist it into not being democratic at all.
No checks and balances.
Okay, because everything stems from this one column, which is essentially what we have at the moment. Multi-party democracy is one column of political administration. Okay, if people believe in it, let them have it. But it should never exist in isolation. Alongside it, we need another column. We need a column of people who actually know what they're talking about, as opposed to politicians.
So it's the technically adept, the scientists, those qualified in certain technical areas.
People who are experts in their own field, who are elected by their peers, by the people in their field.
So it's a peer-reviewed process.
To represent not them, they're representing the whole profession. They're representing the field of understanding. So we have people, mathematicians, in the Senate. But they remember that although the Mathematician Guild may decide to have a representative who's there for a year, on the other hand, the Mathematician Guild may say, well, we actually want to rotate our representatives at every meeting because that's what we want to do. Because remember, it's mathematics that's being represented, not Senator Joe Maths. It is maths itself. And this is a different form of column which is less personnel orientated and much more orientated towards expertise, towards understanding. And let's call that the Senate, the second column of administration. But 2 columns is never good, because the point is, if they argue 50-50, who the hell's right? So obviously you have to have the third column. And the third column is obvious. What about us? We aren't complete morons sitting here. We may not be professors, we may not be politicians, but we certainly are not morons. And the ordinary people should have their voice in direct democracy as well, particularly as the internet and the modern technology is wonderfully designed to facilitate it. But of course, people have come up with the theory, well, if you do that, then you're simply just going to have a very uneducated decision being taken, because people would simply very often not understand what they're voting for. And I agree, this is something which should not occur in any of the columns. And if it does occur amongst the political column, well, that's the nature of that particular animal. But amongst the people, obviously, you have to have qualified voting according to the level at which you're making a decision. For example, if you're making a decision about the local environment, about whether or not trees are planted here or over there, by all means, you don't need to have a degree in botany to understand that decision. But if you're actually making a decision about national economics, or international action, or how to what we do in the oceans to preserve the fish, I think you actually have to understand a lot more than
surmise and guesswork.
You have to be able to pass an exam which basically qualifies you to take that level of decisions. And everybody taking the exam will actually get a pass mark, and that pass mark itself puts them certainly up the ladder. And everybody should be encouraged to take the exam as often as they want. in order to advance their understanding of international economics and science and politics and all the rest of it, so that they move up the ladder and are able to take bigger and bigger decisions. Of course, it will be the duty under molecularism of every state to provide the facilities to do that.
So education we're talking here.
And this is real education, isn't it? Because it's making certain that the people are actually qualified to vote on what they're voting for.
So here's a corollary for you. Given that we've seemed to have strayed a little bit from immigration, we actually haven't, because at this point we can then say, all right, we see a rise in education. We see as people are encouraged to participate more in the decisions in their system on a more granular level. Does the rise in education somehow impact maybe some of the pre-existing fears about immigration?
Well, I mean, I was actually talking about the need for education as being something which is always going to be a general need. In other words, without education, our species is doomed. We have to educate ourselves. We have to make certain that we are living in a world of people who are cognizant of the planet around them. As far as this immigration thing is concerned, what we're talking about is, at the moment, some people have the urge to have racially pure communities. And they're not an inconsiderable number either. We're not talking about a fringe Nazi element here. We're talking about a very broad mass of people across the globe. We have to respect that. It will gradually change with education, and with real internationalization under molecularism, the tendency to want that will diminish with each passing decade. But if we try to enforce politically correct ideologies on everybody, regardless of their state of development, their state of evolution, their cultural background, then surely we are no better than the type of oppression that we're trying to replace. We have got to respect that some people want to live very different lives to the way we want to live. What we're talking about is that internationally, no nation can hold the sword of Damocles over other nations' heads and say, you will be like me. You will do as I say, which is the system we have at the moment, and the system that all of us in our stomachs know is wrong and must be got rid of for the safety of all. Because, of course, the people holding this sword of Damocles are not doing so for the sake of some idealistic virtue like Christianity or something. No, they're doing so for one purpose alone, and that is the survival of the plutocrats. First and foremost, the elite. Because if we do nothing about the planet, if we simply just allow this show to carry on the way it's going and the way they are directing it, we're talking about desertification. We're talking about inundation of continents. We're talking about such a loss of habitable land that many people are going to have to be got rid of. And obviously the plutocrats don't intend to be amongst that group. And so consequently their power and their ability to cull people if necessary, to eliminate them with bacteria and viruses and fake diseases, and their ability to save themselves with drugs from any of such diseases going around, is ultimately their gain. We have to stop this madness, because remember, nobody's designing it like this. I am not saying that there is some monster sitting in a room in New York or somewhere who's designing all this. What we're talking about is a process. It's a process rather like bacteria moving over a pile of food that's been left in a cupboard for 6 months. It gradually extends across it. It has its own power. And this is greed. Greed is a force inside the human race, which, if left uncleaned, uncontrolled, simply consumes everything like the mould on food.
So you really think that greed is human nature?
It's inside us.
What's your evidence for that?
Well, I mean, of course, you have this wonderful Marx Hegelian dialect on the subject of whether we are born good and we become corrupted by the world around us, or whether we're born uncivilized and raw, and we are actually civilized by the world around us. This debate is not something that I can reach a categoric conclusion on. I've read both sides of the argument, and I remain feeling that at the end of the day, we are thinking of good and bad in very, very narrow fields here. Mm-hmm. What is good and for some people is bad for another, and vice versa. So in this question of whether or not we are born greedy or not, can we take greed not as just simply being a negative thing, but think of it as being a force which is there to make us move forwards?
So, I mean, it could be something a little bit like what the story of Icarus is about, the idea of reaching ever higher, that kind of greed, the greed for height. Maybe.
Exactly. It's all part of that same human urge. Mm-hmm. The point is that if we associate this urge with greenbacks, with pieces of paper with figures on them, and with fast cars and with all the trappings of glamour, if we associate that urge in that direction, then we will destroy the planet. Because, of course, there is not enough resources for everybody to have this. And if only some people have got it, then what about everybody else who wants it?
Right.
So consequently, we have to sublimate this urge. We have to direct it into something more positive. And the greatest thing that we can direct it towards is actually creating a sustainable planet. Surely there is nothing more wonderful, more noble for us as a human race to do than to make this planet a stable place for all of life forms to live, not just ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Richard, one of the elements that we're discussing here is essentially monetary reform, because we're still dealing with a currency, we're still dealing with finance in the sense of that. You know, it might be a very stripped down different form. We are still dealing with exchange based on common tokens, if you like. Now, one of the pressures that a system such as this is going to meet is one of increasing automation, simply because it's more productive. As the system fails, more people get fired and automation is put in place. Of course, it saves money, so it's actually enforced by the system as well. But of course, it's sort of a good direction, I think, because it automates a lot of meaningless jobs and will increasingly automate more and more complex jobs. So we're dealing with an inevitable trend towards unemployment. How does this impact your system? And let me put it a different way. How does your system think it can overcome or better a human society when faced with massive unemployment and increasing unemployment?
Well, within the current structure of economics, we are having increasing unemployment, and we will continue to have increasing unemployment, as you are discussing. And were the continuation of token money, as you introduced your point, to be the central issue of the economic structure that we are talking about, you would be correct to have concerns about an inability to cope with unemployment. But of course, remember, the central part of molecularism is a number of adjustments which will actually create considerably greater employment. For example, of course, a wealth limit, by definition, is going to limit the amount of time that many people will want to spend in the system once they've reached their allotted level of wealth. Mm-hmm. And this would therefore open the way to other people to get there as well. But the most important thing to realise is that if you look around the streets, there is jobs needed to be done everywhere. It's not as if we don't have things for people to do. What we don't have is an economic structure that basically allows people to do them and still make a living. And one of the big changes that has occurred in society is the fact that many of the forms of help that individually we would have had from other people even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, no longer exists. For example, if you're going to a railway station and you're travelling by train, even 20 or 30 years ago, if you were having difficulty with your bags, it would just take seconds before someone would be there, and for a modest contribution, your bags would be dealt with.
A porter, the French is a porter,
as it used to be. And this is just the tip of an iceberg in the sort of service that used to be there for us. And is no longer there. And it's not that we should think of the porter as being sort of a lowly person working beneath the traveller. No, because that porter the next day may well be the traveller himself and may well want a porter himself. The point is that it's simply a function in society. And these jobs have been disappearing. They've been disappearing all the time and nobody's paying any attention to it. So I do not personally believe that there will come a stage where all human beings are redundant, because the care that each one of us needs is actually increasing and not decreasing, because we need care in all sorts of ways today that we never needed in the past. I mean, for example, the amount of time I have to spend as a person of my age getting to understand computers and dealing with all the issues of all the technology around me is really frustrating. Wouldn't it be great if I could basically have somebody to help me in this score, which there are so many qualified people out there, but I can't employ them because the method of employing people is so complex, so unbelievably expensive. For me as a private individual to give a job to somebody else, I can't dream of it. And this is the same state that we're all in. In other words, we can no longer help each other because the state has made it only possible for us to earn money within its structured system. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why we have unemployment. And I often wonder why the state and the elite leads us into this direction so energetically.
Well, you can control unemployed people very easily. Anybody with a lack of access, which is really a lack of money in this system, is controlled with promises, with reform that never materializes. I think it's quite simple to see why people...
The Tsarist regime in Russia found it greatly difficult to control unemployed people.
And why was that?
Because, of course, when unemployed people have nothing, and they have no hope, and no dignity, and no self-respect, they tend to get angry. And so consequently the danger of mass unemployment must be clear to this current regime as well. But nonetheless they continue to attract it.
Well, think about it from a logic point of view from this current version of capitalism. I don't know what you would call it, disaster capitalism, whatever, which sees implicitly the unemployed and, let's say, those on benefits as a direct threat to the money to more money principle. It's something for nothing, and that can't be tolerated in a system of ownership, of profit, of gain at someone else's loss. I think that might be, I submit to you, a reason why the welfare state is the welfare state that it is. What do you think? And of course, that I must qualify that very quickly. It's very different in different countries. Some countries have very, very powerful forms of state subsidy for the unemployed, essentially, and it works to varying degrees. But that might be one logic, is that it is fundamentally at odds with the implicit agreement that forms the centre of the system.
Well, I rather think that in many ways what's happening is that there has been an enormous change in the resultant product of employment. That in the past, the product of employment used to benefit the broad mass of society by producing lots of goods, by producing lots of services, and generally speaking, it was spread quite widely about. But what we noticed recently is that the actual product of our employment is being taken up more and more by a smaller and smaller group. In other words, the elite have got no shortage for luxury goods and luxury services, hotels, casinos, golf clubs, all the trappings that go with it. And this sector of the market is drawing more and more people into it, so that their entire purpose of life, you might say, their entire purpose of production is to provide a luxury service for the elite. And that tendency I can see not abating as long as this elite have power. So, as I say, it's not something which is conscious that's going on. Nobody is planning this. It is simply a process which is inevitable from the psyche that we have, this energy that we have, which will always make a power into a corrupting force. The moment that anybody has that degree of power, they will be corrupted by it and seek more power and more power. And wealth and power are almost the same thing. They're equivalent. They're roots to each other. And so consequently, the seeking of wealth and power is an inexorable force that simply goes on, whatever the consequences. It's not rationally considered. And that's what I think is going on, that even the people who are participating in this elite don't consciously realise the effect of what they're doing.
I think that's absolutely correct. I wouldn't want to argue with that, even as just a point to argue on. How do you see the system adapting as employment increases? At the moment we have we have official figures of 10% unemployment. They might be closer to 20. What when it's 50?
Unemployment increases.
Yes, absolutely.
As unemployment increases, so too will the pressure for fundamental change go with it.
Right.
And that pressure will, of course, lead to social change, because, of course, when people have nothing and no hope, they will listen to the sort of messages that both your organisation and mine are giving out, that we have to basically collectivise and fight for a better future.
Meet need, so to speak. Yeah. Needs as identified by the failings of the system that overarch those emergent needs. Okay, yeah. What about the worry that a system of, it's going to be a loaded term, global governance or collectivization or this kind of broad amalgamation, if you like, of states, won't be able to adapt to each individual's needs. It's too broad, it's too coarse, it can't take into account lots of different factors. I'll give some very simple ones. Areas of general lack of education, disability, particular travel issues. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Well, of course, if you were to have a system of administration which would be so centralised that all the day-to-day mechanics of life are controlled by it, it would be monstrous. It would be unbelievably awful.
It reminds me very much of, when you put it that way, it reminds me very much of Brazil, the film, where everything is on a piece of paper somewhere and paperwork is paperwork and it just goes round and round and round.
I don't seriously think that anybody would want that, and anybody reading molecularism or reading the charter in some detail would appreciate that it's precisely not what molecularism is about. Molecularism is about the formation of nation states which are all autonomous and which are all roughly equal in size, and which have the ability to choose their own systems of government, their own cultural rules, if you like. For example, matters like capital punishment and ages of consent and such fundamental things which affect people locally, but of course these are local decisions, they are societal rules. Molecularism is not like a political concept such as Marxism or communism or fascism, that actually believed in dictating to the people all what they should be doing, all what they should be thinking, what was the perfect way of life, how should you as a good party member be performing. This is not what molecularism is about. Molecularism is a structure to facilitate freedom first and foremost, a structure to facilitate the multiplicity of cultures which all of us wish to see possible. And the central administration that we're talking about is simply a form of regulating the economy of the system. It is a federal economic structure, not a federal political structure. And that difference must be understood. Because, of course, if we don't federalise our economies, by definition, we have to compete with each other. By definition, we are basically saying, what's best for America? Well, what's best for Europe or whatever, or best for Britain. And this means that we're trying to say what's best for me is worst for you when we're doing the deals. And that, of course, is a negative way of looking at our brothers and sisters in other countries. Only by having a single economic system where we're all basically part and parcel of the same boat will this crazy competition between nations for economic advantage over each other come to an end. And then we will stop wasting so much human resources, physical resources, time and energy pursuing rainbows. Then we can actually coordinate ourselves and carry out the reforms we need to cope with climate change much more effectively. We can't agree at Kyoto and Copenhagen and Durban because we're all in competing economies, and as long as we are in competing individual capitalist economies, we will never agree. Pure, simple fact. The only way out is to federalise the economy of the world into one central system, which means one currency. Of course, you can't have multiplicity of currencies. Why should you have? But of course, that in itself is a move towards something much better. I, like you, don't like the idea of money as being the basis of society, but it is the way that we are used to at the moment. The only way that we can move beyond it to a resource-based economy, which many people are, of course, thinking about these days, the only way we can move towards that wonderful ideal is to go through a system in which we would go into one currency, go into a single economy, so that we can make that transition later on. Because we certainly can't get to it from where we are now.
So you see a singular economy and a singular fiscal system as the bridge because it necessitates, or at least allows, for resource preservation a little bit more strongly through the fact that it's also getting around the idea of competition. I agree there's a huge amount of waste in the competitive process, so you see it perhaps as an amelioration of the current system towards a resource system.
Certainly in that direction, but I think much more fundamentally it will change things like, for example, it is very difficult for any nation to carry out serious environmental and ecological protection systems and preservation systems when its neighbour is not doing the same. Because there is no central coordination possible. It makes the efforts of so many nations meaningless. It makes even trying to think about it meaningless, and yet the reality is unless we do, we're all sunk.
Okay. What about this then as a natural follow-on? Gosplan, Russian planned economies, 5-year plans, the measurement of toothbrushes, the allocation of a certain number of miles per day per car. This all smacks of a similar idea to the essential homogenization and central planning of something like molecularism. That failed, this is communism, this will fail, and so on.
Well, look, molecularism is very much like built on a similar concept to the EU, only it would have a centralised economy as opposed to separate economies. But what's happening in the EU at the moment is the fact that each nation basically is allowed to function within the system as long as it fulfills the rules and basically carry out its own policies. This homogenisation thing is something that I've spoken about earlier on. I just don't think it's going to occur. In fact, molecularism, funnily enough, is the way to protect the world against homogenisation. There is a far greater chance, in fact, not even there's a certainty of homogenisation under the continuation of the existing system, because we only have to see how now similar Shanghai, Durban, Pretoria, Brasilia, Mexico City, Los Angeles, London, Berlin. What's the difference between them? You see the same shops. There's the same high street, the same products.
It's the cheapest thing in the world to manufacture the same thing over and over again.
So homogenization is something which the current system is enforcing, and certainly it's very important to stop this.
Do you think that an economy that is planned in any way can be attuned to human need, and is even possible given the fact that not human nature, but human requirements are, and I'll use again a loaded term, irreducibly complex?
Well, that's a very almost tautological question in many ways, because if you think about it, we often think that a free market economy, which is like the opposite of a planned economy, is unplanned. And yet, of course, that in itself is a total nonsense. Because it's a free market economy, it will function according to the scientific principles of the free market. It's not free at all. It's actually a planned economy which operates to a system which can be understood by economists and by many people working in the field. They can understand this animal. And therefore, it is entirely planned because it's entirely predictable the way that it goes. And when we are saying that there is an opposition to the concept of a planned economy, it is because that is the only way to oppose this bacteria concept that I'm talking about, how this bacteria is gradually taking over the entire planet and will eventually destroy it. It will eventually destroy it. The only way to stop that is to have a planned system that actually fights it. The only way to fight global warming is with planning. I'm afraid we can't simply carry on in the notion that everything will be all right and any plans are bad, any leadership is wrong, because as long as we do that, we'll get nowhere.
Okay.
You try making a business unless you plan.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. So how about this? The current structure is heavily owned. That's the definition of the current structure, if you could even define it as a structure, or indeed a system. We are talking about the socialization of life goods, of movements, the freeing up of a lot of what is now privately owned. How do you plan on getting the owners of this system, which are not very many, into, if you like, relegating their ownership and freeing up the systems, the processes, the resources, the land that at the moment makes them a pretty penny, thank you very much, and to essentially create or move towards this kind of molecular system?
Look, we can own properties. We can own our homes. We can own our furniture and our cars. We can even own, theoretically, the land. We might own other businesses, other buildings. But there's one thing that nobody can really own, and that is the resources that everybody needs.
But they do right now.
But that's got to end.
Why?
Because anybody who has those resources under their ownership has the ability to basically extort the rest of the population.
Exactly.
To hold undue power over them. If you own the water, basically you control the world. And this idea is obscene.
It might be to you, but you do face the very real difficulty of a legal system and an economic system which presupposes the defence of private property, which has now morphed into resource ownership. How do you get around that?
Well, because the interests of society must always come first in the enforcement of any law. And if the interests of society dictate that essential resources should be owned in common, then the law will make it so in exactly the same way as it did in the Soviet Union in 1917, in exactly the same way as it did with compensation, to be fair, in the nationalisation of British industries during the post-war era.
So do you see this as an inevitability that private ownership will fail?
it's not about failing. It's private ownership of certain natural resources are dangerous because it creates too much power in the hands of unelected and potentially irresponsible people. Now, we're not talking about wealth when we're talking about money here. We're talking about power. And what is the value of having democratically elected governments if they do not have the power to suppress the demands of unelected plutocrats?
So you're suggesting now that the demand for these resources to be freed up will be a product of the need to have them freed up?
But the point is that, as I've said, the people can demand this and they can fight for it by withdrawing their consumer cooperation. And that is a very powerful weapon indeed. And nothing that the state can call terroristic, nothing that the state can really fight against. And so
we've seen them call them terrorists, though. I mean, what about the way that New Orleans unfolded? That's a perfect microcosm of what you're talking about, because it's essentially a tidal wave that destroys the system, has devastating effects upon the land. And you see people either finding food if they're white or looting it if they're black or not white. We see this kind of talk a lot. It is used now to defend the values that are being projected by that very same media. So that's going to definitely happen as a potential questioning of private property ownership arises in certain areas. It doesn't have to be everywhere. You're going to see a pressure from the governing forces, which may be people or processes or a mixture of both, to defend this very idea that private ownership is the best way, is the way that we can control these resources. If we just open it up to mass consumption, it'll be like the bacteria destroying the meat in the cupboard.
Well, I think the opposite of private ownership of natural resources is open it up to mass consumption.
No, but that's the language that will be used to criticise this very idea.
Well,
so how do we get around it?
The point is there'll be all sorts of languages used to criticise something which benefits the people and attacks the interests of the plutocrats. So I'm perfectly prepared to have all sorts of shit thrown at me in the idea that I put up.
Does that mean a general understanding or rejection, actually, of the central media in order to get to this thinking? Because a lot of people don't think like this. That's the thing. A huge amount of people don't even consider ownership as a problem. They think it's freedom.
Well, we have to differentiate between the word ownership and the concept of ownership of essential resources, because, of course, this is not a communistic ideal that I'm talking about. What we have come up with is something which encourages private ownership of your home, for example. I do not think it is healthy for people to perpetually enrich landlords simply because they need to live with four walls and a roof over their heads. And so consequently, people should be encouraged to own their own homes. There's nothing wrong with private ownership. What is wrong is when private ownership reaches a level beyond your personal needs and goes into the realms of power over others. That is when private ownership becomes uncomfortable. To a certain extent, we can be happy that some people are going to be quite rich, maybe, and have second homes. Okay, fine, But when it comes to owning oil fields, on which whole economies depend, whole nations depend, millions of people's lives and their hopes and aspirations depend upon this, why on earth should this be owned by one family? How on earth could this benefit the world in any way whatsoever, when it should be held in common for everybody, just like the common land in principle was by the early medieval settlers. They thought always about having a piece of land in the centre of the village that belonged to everybody.
The commons.
The
sure,
common.
Of course.
And this is a concept that was very important to them, and it should be important to us today. The resources of the world are commons. They are held in common, and nobody can own them privately. This seems to be a principle of life. And yes, we have to fight for it. And yes, of course, the sheikhs and the people who own all these oil fields will fight like hell to stop it being taken away from them. But of course the choice can be given, because ultimately, unless this ground is given by the current plutocrats, then they have to consider the alternative. They can twist and try to keep it, in which case, of course, they may lose everything. Because, of course, remember that the scale of the reaction against the system is always commensurate with the degree of oppression that it created. And if they continue this level of oppression, eventually the people are going to say, you don't own anything, mate.
Yep.
In other words, the wealth limit will be set lower and lower and lower and lower until in the end the people are voting for literal communism. They're voting for literally, nobody can have more than £1,000 or something. Which, of course, would be not something that I would advocate. But, of course, the point is I'm not saying that this is something that we can logically choose. I keep saying this is a process that we're involved in. And the plutocrats better realise this process as much as we've got to realise it. They've got to give away some of their power in order to keep the rest of it.
So we are talking about mass awareness on all levels.
Of course.
So why don't we conclude then, having run through some of the objections. The big question is, Richard, where is molecularism going? What are its next moves? How do you foresee its possible future, its progression, and so on?
Well, it's a wonderful thing to be part of a living organism, I tell you that. I mean, it's an amazing experience to be part of all this. And I am buoyed up by the wonderful enthusiasm that I have from people who write to me and say that they're waiting there to do whatever it needs to be done to get the idea going. Plainly, there is a lot of work to be done to basically spread awareness, and so we have to spread awareness. At the moment, we're still not... we haven't broken through into normal consciousness, broad stream consciousness, and that will eventually occur. But one of the ways in which the people here in Berlin are wanting to move, and that is to create a formal political party and to basically put ourselves on the map in this way, because it'd be a very odd political party, because we're saying we don't want to form a government. Now, when you vote for us, it is simply registering a vote of dissatisfaction with the current system.
It's a none of the above.
It is a system change vote. Goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this interview, that effectively, if we look around us, we can see quite quickly that we actually need system change, not climate change. We need to have something new, and the only way that we can see that that voice can begin to be heard is by having people at the ballot box who are saying, hey, we represent system change and we have a system. I mean, we've actually got a system. I mean, the point is that yes, it may have its ups and downs to some people, and maybe that it might be adapted in some form or another, but the point is at least we've got a system. Because there's no point in tearing down something unless you've got something to replace it with. And so therefore, for a lot of people who think along those lines, there will be an opportunity for them to vote. I think the whole way in which something comes into the public eye is actually a process which cannot be necessarily manipulated or coordinated. I'm a great believer in the flow of fate and the flow of history. And what normally happens is that some event will occur, some trigger will suddenly propel this idea or an idea like it or something very similar to it into the forefront, and it will have its own momentum after that. You must remember that this is not about trying to push an idea that we as a group have thought up of. It's more like something that we have simply uncovered, a process that we've simply uncovered through many different forms of learning and research that we've gone through. And the more we've looked into it, the more we've suddenly picked up books and realised that people have been saying the various different elements of this for many, many years in many different countries.
These ideas are not new, and that's what's so wonderful about them.
And in fact, we're seeing that all that we have done in actual fact is subconsciously, without conscious arrangement, taken all these different ideas and simply just put them into a single pie. And that pie is something which is so simple for the ordinary person to understand, so easy to fight for, insofar as all you really need to do is to hold up this piece of paper and say, unless and until my government or a political party representing me takes this to the United Nations, I am going to withdraw my cooperation in consumerism. I am going to go on consumer strike. Mm-hmm. And I can last out as long as you can, we say to the system, because you need us buying your stuff more than we need the stuff, when you really think about it.
And they have quarterly profits, and we have more than 3 months' time, don't we?
Exactly. And that simple reality, which I would sum up on, is the core of the most central points that are put to me, that it's just a fanciful dream, that it can never really take place. And I simply say, realise the power of your consumer money. Control it. Reduce it. Don't simply throw it away, and the system will change. And because they need us more than we need them. And when that is understood by a critical mass of people, and because the figures we're talking about don't have to be great for this to be, to be so, when that is realised by a critical mass of people, change will occur very, very quickly. Be like the glasses, suddenly goes bang. A critical mass of people realise that by not spending that money, they can put pressure on the people who can make the world change. And then those people, either saying, okay, we see the sense of it, we will follow this course, or they will try to slog it out, and we will simply have to go through a very uncomfortable situation of revolutionary collapse, shall we say, the nightmare scenario. But if that happens, then we should take heart in the knowledge that if we don't get it done now, then we will be consumed by the current system in the future. That there is no way that the current system can actually exist to the end of the next century in a world which is basically possible to live in. There's just no way. With the sea level rises and so forth that are predicted, it will result in absolute chaos. The chaos will come from the climate change. So we shouldn't really be too worried about creating it through fighting for political change in the meantime.
Well, Richard, thank you very much.